Donald Trump announced today that he would recognize the city of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel by moving the American embassy to Jerusalem. Hi, I'm Lucas Kagi. I serve as History Department Chair at Providence Classical Christian Academy in Rogers, Arkansas. So with this declaration, there's going to be an outcry. There's going to be a lot of back and forth and clamor about what this means for the region, for Palestine, for the peace process, for U.S. relationship with Israel and Palestine. It's going to clearly put tension in that region. It's going to put political tension within even the United Nations and those involved with that peace process. My purpose right now is to give a little bit of background as to the creation of the modern state of Israel. At the end, I will give a little bit of information about how the inside baseball, the politics in the United States, plays into this decision, why that was Donald Trump's decision and not in the hands of Congress. But my goal as a historian and as a scholar is to really help you understand the background leading up to this point, a background that a lot of people really don't understand. So let's begin. As of 70 AD, the Jews are scattered when the Romans finally destroy Jerusalem. That is what we call the diaspora. And Jews end up moving all around the world. A number of them move to Europe. Let's jump forward now, just about 2,000 years, and come to World War I. Well, Palestine had been in the hands of the Ottoman Empire, a Turkish-based empire, for centuries by the time we get to World War I. The Ottomans, hoping to join who they believed would be the winners in World War I, join the Austrians and the Germans, join part of the Triple Alliance in order to be seen favorably among the European powers. In 1908, a group of Turks known as the Young Turks had taken over the Turkish government, overthrown the Sultan there, and essentially their goal was to orient the Ottoman Empire toward Europe, to secularize it and to industrialize it. So that was 1908. Well, turns out, of course, that the Ottomans didn't join the winning side of the war, and they just opened themselves up all sorts of problems as a result of choosing to join the Central Powers in World War I. Namely, that the British, operating out of Egypt, where they had already been in charge of the Suez Canal for several decades, were going to incite various rebellions, namely among the Arabs in Arabia. But then also, as a result of their operations in the Middle East during World War I, that would give them virtual control over what would remain of the Ottoman Empire as the World War ended. So World War I comes to an end. Ottoman Empire is now basically a completely defeated power at the hands of the British and the French, who controlled the peace process as a result of World War I. So they're at the League of Nations, which was created as a result of World War I, and the British and the French are essentially going to carve up the Ottoman Empire. They're going to draw borders and call one area Transjordan, which will become modern-day Jordan. They're going to carve up another area and call it Iraq. They're going to carve up another area, call it Palestine, and so on and so forth, Syria and Egypt, and go from there. And basically, they're going to allow the British and the French to operate these as British and French mandates under the supervision of the League of Nations. At least that's the theory. In reality, whichever country controls whichever territory has ultimate authority over that territory. So, for example, the French had authority over Transjordan. The British would get Palestine, and that would be called the British Mandate. Now let's back up just to the events during the war. As the war progresses, and it appears that the British are going to have an influence in the Middle East as a result of the outcome of World War I, the Zionist lobby in London begins to become more and more vocal. Now, anti-Semitism was pretty rampant across Europe at the time, including in Israel. But you have a number of Zionists who approached the British Parliament requesting for and lobbying for some form of statehood in Palestine, which they had not had since the Romans destroyed Jerusalem back in 70 AD. So this Zionist lobby is ultimately able to garner from the British government what we now today call the Balfour Declaration, which essentially, I've read the actual document, in very vague and non-committal terms, it essentially says we support the creation of a unique Jewish state, Jewish homeland in Palestine. Well, of course, the Arabs at the time were very upset about this as well. A lot of them were actually tired of Ottoman rule and seeking for wanting their own nation as well. Of course, they would appeal to the British government as well, to which the government responded in equally vague terms. Yes, yes, we understand. You want your own country. There, you have a valid reason for that. Don't worry. So that's the Balfour Declaration. And from that point on, Zionists, those, by the way, Zionists are those who wanted a new Israeli state, are going to point to the Balfour Declaration and saying, look, you promised us a nation. You have a hand here in the Middle East and shaping the Middle East and shaping the political boundaries of the modern Middle East. You owe us a country because you said you'd give us a country. Now, the British would oversee the territory of Palestine between World War I and World War II, the British mandate. They'd have diplomats there, and that was a season of deep, deep unrest. There'd be a series of wars. Well, why? So what happens after World War I is that Jews begin to trickle in, and then more and more and more until you have a flood of Jews returning to Palestine. Well, of course, that's going to result in a lot of tension with the Arabs who are already living there. Now, there's a modern misconception that the Jews going into Palestine went in and literally stole the land from the Palestinians. Now, that did happen in some cases, but by and large, what was happening was that those who were able to travel back to Palestine were those who were either sponsored by British or Americans or other groups, or even Zionist groups. There were a number of Zionist groups that would collect donations and use that money to finance Jews who were willing to go back to Israel, or the Jews who were going back were wealthy enough to finance their own trip and buy land in Palestine. They were able to buy up plots of land. They would buy up more and more and more land in perfectly legal transactions. But then where it really got sticky and where a lot of times there is a critique is that a lot of times these properties, these massive, whether it was dozens or hundreds of acres of property, a lot of the Jewish landlords would then kick Palestinians off and say, this is my property, which it was, and the Palestinians had to leave. And so as you have more and more Jews buying up lands, tensions are growing and fights would ultimately break out. And a lot of times as the result of these fights, the Israeli military, which by the way was trained by the British, very elite forces, generally were extremely successful over their Palestinian neighbors, and would oftentimes acquire land out of these conflicts as well. But by and large, most of the original settlements were bought as any standard real estate transaction. So that is the situation going into World War II. You've got now hundreds of thousands of Jews living in Palestine, and you've had a series of wars. Even the British embassy in Jerusalem had been attacked, had grenades thrown into it at times, and the British are exhausted of dealing with this. Not to mention that after World War II, they will have basically suffered massive economic harm as a result of fighting the Nazis for so long. So they are not in a position, the British Empire by and large would fall apart in the decades following World War II. They're not in a position to maintain their empire anymore. So they're going to hand over control of Palestine to the newly created United Nations, which replaced the League of Nations following World War II. Enter Harry Truman. The United Nations, from what I have studied, was not terribly inclined to grant the Jews living in Palestine their own nation. Harry Truman really took the helm on that. He went to the United Nations. The United States had a lot of clout in the newly created United Nations. Note that the United States had not been part of the League of Nations. The Senate would not ratify that entry, but they were now at the helm of the United Nations, which of course met in and still meets in New York City. And so Harry Truman essentially pressured the United Nations into recognizing Israel as its own nation, and was able to push for a vote there and got what he wanted. They voted for Israeli statehood in 1947, 2 years after the end of World War II. Now, the United Nations was at that point not in a position to offer military support. Of course, the Palestinians were outraged about this. They had gotten no such state of their own. There was a Palestinian revolt. Essentially, the Israelis, attacked to put down the revolt, and essentially through their own military operations during the 1947 and 1948 mini war, were able to secure the borders of what would become Israel. Now, those borders were much smaller than what they are today, but that essentially established the current modern day state of Israel. having already been voted and approved by the United Nations at the urging and pressure of Harry Truman. So we have Israel. Over time, they would acquire a little bit of time to be some negotiations. There would be a vast extension of Israeli territory in the 1967 Six-Day War, in which 5 Middle Eastern nations would essentially build their militaries up, place them on the borders of Israel. Israel preemptively struck and defeated all 5 nations within 6 days in the very famous Six-Day War. As a result, they would acquire more territory, including the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights up in northern Israel, and they would acquire Jerusalem, which had not been in their hands up to that point. Now, Jerusalem, for any viewers who are not familiar with this, is the historical capital of Israel, going back to the time of King David in the Old Testament of the Bible. And so there's a lot of sentimental and historical attachment to that city and religious attachment to that city. The problem is the Muslims also see that as one of their holiest cities, Mecca, of course, being the first, and Medina, and then Jerusalem. These are the 3 holy cities of Islam, and they're not going to just let that city go either. And of course, there's a lot more than religion going on here. Politics and power plays into this whole thing as well. Even for agnostic Jews and agnostic Arabs, of whom there are some, Jerusalem is still a political landmark to hold on to. So with that understanding, we get to the modern situation. I'm not going into all the detail about what has happened regarding Israeli settlements and the Gaza Strip, and there's been a number of negotiation dealings that get really complex and convoluted. But again, my goal is just to really back up the history so you have an understanding of how all this got started. So to wrap it up, now Donald Trump for the first time has announced that it would move the American embassy to Jerusalem. That will cause a lot of unrest. There will be a lot of rhetoric attacking that. There will be a little bit probably defending it. So how did this happen? Let me get a little bit into the politics here and I'll wrap this up. Essentially what happened was back in the early 90s, Congress passed a bill saying, we recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. However, and they entered a caveat that said, we allow the president to sign a waiver basically saying that Jerusalem will not be the capital of Israel. We do not recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Why did they do that? Because Congress didn't want to take responsibility for the unrest it might cause and knew it would cause by recognizing Jerusalem as the capital. They wanted to throw out their essentially their, hey, we support Israel, but we're not going to go so far as to implement it. We're going to put that on the president's shoulders. And so Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush and Barack Obama all signed the waiver saying, all right, we understand Congress has passed this, but you know what, I'm going to continue to recognize Tel Aviv as the capital of Israel, keep our embassy in Tel Aviv. So essentially what has happened is Donald Trump, the political technique he used here was simply to refuse to sign the waiver that Congress had built into this recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of background of what's going on over there. I'll leave it to you to decide which should be the capital according to the U.S., Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. But hopefully that lends a little bit of light.